Imagine someone handed you the instruction manual for a complicated piece of machinery, but half the pages were written in another language, and some of the instructions had been crossed out years ago, and you weren't even sure that you had the latest version. That's exactly how many people feel the first time they open a trust document. The good news is you don't need a law degree to understand most trusts. You simply need to know how to approach them. Hi, I'm Darlynn Morgan. If someone you love has died and you've suddenly found yourself responsible for handling their trust or estate, you're in the right place. One of the first responsibilities of a successor trustee is understanding what the trust actually says. Now, that sounds simple enough, but I've seen plenty of intelligent, capable people read a trust from beginning to end and still close it wondering, did I understand that correctly? After nearly 30 years as a trust and estate attorney, I can tell you it's because most people start in the wrong place. When someone hands me a trust, I don't start reading. I start with a blank sheet of paper. Then I began mapping out the estate plan, the people, the important dates, the assets, and where everything is ultimately supposed to go. Why? Because once you can see the trust visually, the legal language starts making a whole lot more sense. I've found that every trust, whether it's 20 pages or 200, is really answering just 4 questions. Who are we talking about? What property are we talking about? When do these instructions apply? And how does that property ultimately get distributed? Every page of the trust helps answer one of those 4 questions. By the end, you'll know how to read a trust with confidence, identify the sections that actually really matter, and recognize when you've reached a question that's worth calling an attorney about. So let's start with the very first step, which is confirming that you have a complete and correct trust or legal documents in front of you. Now, that may sound obvious, but it's not always the case. Be sure to identify all amendments and any full restatements. This is critical. Amendments modify specific sections, while restatements typically replace all of the original trust. So you have to understand the history, and you have to know how to read them together and understand the most current instructions. So the next thing I actually do is start by looking at the first page and the last page. I'm looking for dates and signatures. I've had situations where I sit down to read a trust and the last page isn't signed or notarized. So then I'm not sure if I'm looking at a draft or the most recent official version of the document. I've also had situations where there are pages missing from the document. Sometimes entire sections were gone. So before reading anything, be sure that you have the most recent and complete copy of the documents. Now, as I go, I'm drawing everything out. The next thing I do is I go back to the trust and I'm reading certain sections, and I'm focused on the people. Before you can understand what a trust is telling you to do, you need to know who it's talking about and their various roles. Starting at the top, who were the creators of the trust? Who were the original trustees? Who are the existing trustees? And who are the successor trustees? Am I the one who's serving now, or is someone ahead of me? And sometimes there's co-trustees who are supposed to serve together. Who are the beneficiaries of the trust? Was anyone disinherited? This is all part of the landscape and filling in the pieces of the story. Next, I need to determine where we are in the timeline. What events have triggered where we are today? Think of it like this. The trust is like a GPS. It contains directions for different trips. But until you know where you're starting from today, whether a spouse has died, whether someone's incapacitated, Whether you're after the first death or after the second death, you may be following directions for the wrong destination. Those answers are going to tell you which instructions in the trust actually apply right now. And many trusts have different rules depending on the situation. And it's easy to read the wrong section if you don't identify this first. Once I know where we are structurally or big picture, then I identify the distributions that are laid out in the trust. So who receives what? When do they receive it? And how do they receive it? Are there specific gifts? Are there beneficiaries who are receiving a share or a percentage of what's left? That's what we call the residuary. The residuary is simply everything that's left after debts, taxes, expenses, and any specific gifts have been paid. For most families, that's actually where most of the estate is. I'm also looking for how the beneficiaries receive their distribution. Is it outright, or does the trust say that they receive it in a continuing trust? Are there age limits or survival requirements or other conditions to how a beneficiary receives their share? At this point, I've built my roadmap, and I know who the people are, and I know the timeline, and I know who eventually receives what. Now, I go back through the trust a second time, and I start working through the details. When I read a trust, I don't just sit back and read the words. I really work through it with a pen in my hand, and I'm underlining, I'm circling, I'm tabbing sections that I need to come back to, and I'm making notes. Your goal on the first pass is to become familiar with the documents, how it's organized, and where the important sections are, and what questions that you still have. Every time you go back to it, you'll understand a little more, because now you know where things are. And if there's a table of contents or headings in the trust, that is very helpful. As you read, you will see there are sections that are clearly what you'd call boilerplate. These are standard provisions in a trust, but they're still very important. And here's another little trick. Whenever you see a word that's capitalized in the middle of a sentence or in all caps, like trustee, descendants, issue, beneficiary, that's often a clue that the trust defines that word somewhere else. And one thing I'll say here, some trusts are short and to the point. Others, lengthy, maybe 100 pages or more. Some are filled with dense legal language. But don't let the length intimidate you. A well-drafted trust is really dependent on the skill and experience of the attorney that drafted it. I've seen 100-page trusts that are perfectly clear and 20-page trusts that are poorly drafted and very confusing. So if something doesn't make sense, don't immediately assume that you're missing something. Trust documents can contain typos, unclear drafting or language, or even genuine errors that leave the trustee with a nightmare to deal with. So confusion isn't always on you. And if you hit conflicting language or something that you can't interpret, that's when you pause and call a trust attorney. Their role is to explain or help interpret what remains unclear after you've taken a first pass with the document. There are times that a trust has a clause that is worded so poorly that even I don't have certainty on its meaning either. And then we need to either get beneficiary consent or court instructions on how to proceed. Now, once you've read the trust and you understand who the people are and how the trust operates, there's one big question left. What assets does the trust actually own? Because a trust can only control the assets that are actually titled in the trust. And that's the next job that every successor trustee has to tackle. And frankly, it's one of the most tedious parts of a trust administration. To make that process easier, I've created a free trust asset inventory and tracking sheet that walks you through every category of asset that you'll want to look for, from bank accounts and real estate to retirement accounts, life insurance, business interests. It's the exact asset inventory tracker that I use so that we always have a clear picture of estate assets and next steps. You can download it using the link in the description. It'll make the next step in the process much more organized, and it'll save you a lot of time.